They say a dog never sits beside water at midnight unless it is waiting for something that never came back. The river outside Millstone, Oregon moved like a slow breath under the weight of a winter night. Dark water folding over itself with no sound except the distant pull of current against stone, and along its edge, under the pale spill of a broken streetlight, Staff Sergeant Caleb Morgan stood still inside the cold that cut through his jacket as if it already knew his name. He had been on routine patrol for nearly 2 hours, boots tracing familiar gravel paths along the perimeter of a quiet riverside service road. Nothing unusual expected, nothing unusual reported, just another night where the world pretended to be peaceful enough to trust, until he saw him. At first it looked like a shadow misplaced, a shape too steady to be debris, too deliberate to be animal movement without purpose. And then Caleb slowed his steps and realized it was a German Shepherd sitting perfectly still at the edge of the riverbank, facing the water as if it held a language no human could hear. The dog did not bark, did not shift, did not acknowledge the approaching light from Caleb's flashlight until it passed over him, revealing a sable coat dusted faintly with mist and a pair of amber eyes that reflected nothing except the river itself. Caleb lowered the beam slightly, instinctively softening his presence the way Marines are trained to do when approaching a wounded animal or a frightened civilian. But there was no fear in the dog, only waiting, an unsettling patience that felt older than the night itself. The wind carried a thin chill off the water, the kind that seeped into skin and settles behind bone. And somewhere far upstream a heron called once before disappearing into darkness again, leaving the world quieter than before. Caleb took another step closer, slow and deliberate, his voice low and steady. "Hey there, buddy, you lost." But the dog did not respond, not even a flick of the ear, only a slight tightening of focus in his gaze, as if the sound had passed through him without meaning. That was when Caleb noticed the posture more than anything else, not the alertness of a stray, not the tension of an animal ready to flee, but the stillness of something anchored, something that had chosen this exact point beside the river and refused to leave it. The collar around his neck was military issue, worn at the edges, the kind used in service units rather than households. And that detail alone shifted something inside Caleb's chest, because dogs like this did not end up alone without a reason that carried weight. He crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible, feeling the cold river air bite through his gloves as he studied the dog's face more carefully. And it was then that he realized the eyes were not simply looking at the water, they were searching it, tracing something unseen beneath the surface as if expecting it to return. The river answered nothing, only continuing its steady movement under the night sky, but the dog remained locked in place, unblinking, unbroken, and Caleb felt a quiet unease settle in because there was something familiar in that kind of waiting, something he had seen before in people who refused to accept absence as final. A memory flickered behind his thoughts, uninvited, of deployment nights when silence after a mission meant more than noise ever could, and he pushed it away gently, focusing again on the present, on the animal in front of him, on the impossible stillness of a living being refusing to move on. He reached slowly toward the collar, not touching yet, just close enough for trust to decide whether it existed, and the dog finally reacted, not by retreating, but by shifting his head slightly toward Caleb's hand, as if recognizing something in him rather than fearing it. The river wind picked up for a moment, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and pine, and Caleb noticed the dog's chest rise and fall in a slow rhythm that suggested he had been there for a long time, longer than comfort, longer than expectation, and still he had not left. Then Caleb spoke again, softer this time, almost under his breath. "What are you waiting for out here?" And for the first time, the dog looked away from the water and directly at him, holding eye contact with a weight that felt almost human in its clarity. In that moment, Caleb understood nothing fully, but he felt something shift beneath the surface of the night, as if the river itself was holding back a truth it was not yet ready to release, and the dog beside it was the only witness willing to stay until it finally did. The silence between them did not break, it expanded. Staff Sergeant Caleb Morgan remained crouched near the edge of the river, feeling the cold seep through the fabric of his gloves as the German Shepherd finally shifted his weight, not in retreat, but in a subtle adjustment that suggested he had been holding still for far too long. The dog's gaze moved away from Caleb's face and returned briefly to the dark water, as if confirming that nothing had changed, as if the answer he was waiting for still had not arrived. Caleb studied him more closely now, noticing the faint tension in the dog's shoulders, not fear, not aggression, but restraint, the kind of controlled stillness trained into service animals who had learned to suppress instinct in favor of discipline. The collar around his neck was frayed at the edges, military-grade but weathered, and there was a small faded tag that Caleb could not read clearly from this distance, though something about it stirred recognition he could not yet place. Caleb slowly lowered himself further until he was almost at eye level with the dog, keeping his movements steady, deliberate, respectful, the way one would approach a fellow soldier who had stopped speaking but not stopped understanding. "You have been out here for a while," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying no command, only acknowledgement, but the dog did not respond in any conventional way. Instead, the German Shepherd exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed less like a reaction and more like a release of something heavy he had been carrying alone. The river continued its steady motion behind them, indifferent to their presence, reflecting fragments of light that broke apart before they could become anything solid, and Caleb felt a strange familiarity in the scene, though he could not yet name it. There was something about the dog's posture that did not belong to abandonment alone, it belonged to memory, to ritual, to repetition, as if this was not the first night he had come here, and perhaps not the second or third either. Caleb shifted slightly, adjusting his balance on the gravel, and the sound of it caused the dog's ears to flick once, sharp and precise, the only immediate reaction since Caleb had arrived. The dog did not turn away, but something changed in his focus, a subtle recalibration, as though he had decided Caleb was not an interruption, but something to be evaluated and perhaps tolerated. Caleb extended his hand a little further, not rushing, not insisting, and this time the German Shepherd leaned forward just enough for the air between them to close by a fraction, enough for Caleb to catch the faint scent of wet fur and cold earth. That scent triggered something deeper in his memory, a fragment of training days, river crossings during field exercises, the presence of K-9 units moving alongside Marines in coordinated silence, and for a moment, he wondered if this dog had once been part of something like that. The thought settled heavily because service dogs did not usually end up sitting alone by rivers unless something had disrupted the world they understood as permanent. Caleb's eyes drifted again to the tag, and as he squinted slightly to bring it into focus, the dog suddenly stood, not abruptly, but with a calm intention that felt like a decision long prepared. Caleb did not move back. Instead, he remained steady as the German Shepherd took one step away from the water, then another, his gaze still fixed forward, not at Caleb, but toward the path that followed the riverbank. It was not until that moment that Caleb realized the dog had not been waiting for anything in the water itself, but for something beyond it, something that required a witness rather than a rescuer. The dog paused, turned his head just slightly, and looked back at Caleb with an expression that carried a weight too complex to reduce to instinct alone, and then he began to walk slowly along the river's edge. Caleb hesitated only a second before following, rising from his crouch and stepping carefully onto the damp gravel trail, keeping a respectful distance as he matched the dog's pace. The night air felt heavier now, as if the river had grown quieter to make room for whatever was about to be revealed, and Caleb noticed that with every step the dog took, his posture changed, not relaxed, but focused, as though the act of moving forward required more courage than standing still ever had. The path curved gently, following the natural bend of the river, and the sound of water became softer here, partially hidden by reeds and stone, until only the occasional ripple broke the stillness. Caleb's thoughts drifted again to the insignia on the collar, the faint suggestion of military service, and he began to consider possibilities he had not allowed himself to fully form yet. A retired K-9, perhaps transferred between units, or one left without assignment after restructuring, but none of those explanations fully accounted for the way the dog had been waiting, as if location itself carried meaning. After several minutes of silent walking, the German Shepherd slowed and stopped near a cluster of flat stones partially covered in moss, positioned just above the waterline, and Caleb noticed immediately that this place felt different, not visually, but emotionally, as if it held significance that the river itself had not erased. The dog stepped onto the stones carefully, then sat again, this time not facing the water, but facing the land behind them, and Caleb followed his gaze to a small object partially hidden near the edge of the grass. He moved closer, kneeling once more, and as he reached forward to clear the damp leaves away, he felt a subtle tightening in his chest because the object was not random debris, but something placed with intention, something that had remained here longer than the night itself. The German Shepherd watched him closely now, no longer distant, no longer detached, as if the act of discovery was something he had been waiting to share rather than endure alone, and Caleb realized in that moment that whatever story this river held, it was no longer only the dog's to carry. Caleb Morgan stayed still for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on the patch of ground the German Shepherd had chosen to investigate, as if the night itself had hidden something there on purpose. The air felt colder in that exact spot, not physically different in temperature, but heavier in meaning, as though the river had carried more than just water through this stretch of land. The dog stood beside him now, no longer focused on the water, but fully engaged with Caleb's presence, watching every small movement he made with quiet expectation. Caleb slowly lowered himself again, careful not to disturb the ground too quickly, and began brushing away damp leaves that clung to the soil in thin layers, shaped by recent wind and moisture. Beneath them, something hard and weathered emerged, and before he even fully saw it, Caleb felt the shift in his breathing, the subtle recognition of something deeply personal. It was a metal object, worn down by time and exposure, edges dulled, but shape still intact, partially buried near the edge of a flat stone as if placed there with intention rather than discarded. Caleb paused before touching it fully, his fingers hovering for a brief second, and when he finally lifted it free, he realized it was a military identification tag, the kind issued to service members whose identities were meant to remain with them even when everything else changed. The German Shepherd stepped closer as the object came into view, his posture tightening slightly, not with anxiety, but with anticipation, as if confirming that this moment had finally arrived. Caleb turned the tag carefully in his hand, wiping away moisture with his thumb, and the engraved letters became visible enough for him to read, though faint from where. The name etched into the metal was partially scratched, but still legible enough to trigger recognition in Caleb's memory, and in that instant, something in the atmosphere seemed to shift, as if the river had been holding its breath until now. Caleb looked up at the dog, and for the first time since they met, he understood that the German Shepherd had not been wandering, nor waiting aimlessly, but returning repeatedly to this exact place for reasons tied to someone he had once known. The dog did not look away when Caleb met his gaze, instead holding it with a steady intensity that felt almost like confirmation, as if he was asking Caleb not to misunderstand what this place meant. Caleb rose slowly to his feet, holding the tag in his palm, and took a small step back to get a wider view of the surroundings, noticing details he had overlooked before, including faint impressions in the grass, where someone or something had once remained still for long periods of time. The river continued its steady movement beside them, indifferent yet constant, and Caleb suddenly realized why the dog's attention had been so fixed on the water earlier, not because something was there, but because something had once ended there in silence. The German Shepherd turned his head slightly toward the path they had come from, then back toward the river, repeating the motion once more as if guiding Caleb through a memory rather than a physical route. Caleb understood then that this was not a random encounter, but a deliberate return to a place charged with history, and the dog had been preserving it in the only way he knew how, by coming back again and again without certainty of outcome. He looked down at the tag once more, feeling its weight in his hand, and a name he had not spoken in a long time seemed to rise in his thoughts without permission, not fully formed, but close enough to change the meaning of everything he was witnessing. The dog sat down again beside the stone, this time closer to Caleb, as if acknowledging that the discovery had been made together and the distance between them had shifted from uncertainty to something quieter, something closer to understanding. Caleb knelt slowly beside him, placing the tag carefully on his palm again as if reassessing its significance. And for the first time since the beginning of the night, he spoke not as a Marine giving instruction, but as someone trying to make sense of something that did not fit any report or training he had ever received. The German Shepherd responded by lowering his head slightly, resting his gaze on the tag, then returning it to Caleb, as if the answer he had been carrying alone was no longer meant to remain silent. The river behind them continued its unbroken flow, but the space between man and dog no longer felt empty. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken began to take form, not as conclusion, but as the first step toward understanding why neither of them had truly left this place behind. Caleb Morgan remained kneeling beside the river stone, the identification tag resting in his palm, like something far heavier than metal should ever feel, while the German Shepherd sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched, sharing the same cold air that drifted off the water. The night around them had not changed, yet something inside it felt rearranged, as if the discovery had altered the shape of silence itself. Caleb turned the tag slowly once more, reading the worn engraving again, letting his mind catch up with what his eyes were already beginning to accept. The name was tied to memory, not distant memory, but operational memory, the kind carried by Marines who had served in overlapping rotations, crossed paths in briefing rooms, and shared missions where details were never fully spoken out loud. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of recognition settle in, though he did not speak the name aloud yet, as if saying it would make the moment more real than he was prepared to handle. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, adjusting his posture so that he now faced Caleb directly rather than the river, and in that simple movement there was a quiet insistence, as if he had been waiting for Caleb to reach this exact point of understanding before moving forward. Caleb looked at him fully now, noticing the subtle details that had been overlooked before, the way the dog's eyes carried a stillness that was not emptiness, but restraint shaped by memory, and the way his breathing remained steady even as everything around them seemed to slow. "You have been coming here for a reason," Caleb said softly, more to himself than to the dog, and the German Shepherd responded by lowering his head a fraction, acknowledging the truth without breaking eye contact. The river continued to flow behind them, but its sound now felt distant, as though it belonged to another part of the world entirely, one that no longer had direct access to this moment. Caleb rose carefully to his feet, keeping the tag secure in his hand, and took a slow step toward the water's edge again, scanning the shoreline with a different awareness than before. The stones along the bank were uneven, some half submerged, others exposed by shifting currents, and between them were small signs of repetition, worn paths in the grass, where something had returned often enough to leave traces behind. The German Shepherd followed Caleb's movement without hesitation, staying close but not intrusive, guiding more by presence than by action, as if he understood that answers now required observation rather than instinct. Caleb stopped near the edge of the water and looked down, noticing how the river curled around the stones in a pattern that felt almost deliberate, as if shaping itself around something it refused to fully reveal. He knelt again, this time closer to the waterline, and examined a patch of disturbed earth partially hidden by reeds, where the soil appeared recently shifted compared to the surrounding ground. The dog remained still behind him, watching not the water, but Caleb's hands, as if waiting for the next moment of recognition to unfold. Caleb reached forward and carefully brushed aside the damp grass, revealing a second object, smaller than the first but similarly weathered, and when he lifted it, he realized it was a fragment of fabric attached to a worn strap, the kind used in field equipment or service gear. His breath slowed as he turned it over, recognizing markings consistent with military use, though faded beyond easy identification, and the realization formed gradually rather than suddenly, like a memory surfacing through layers of time. The German Shepherd moved one step closer, then stopped, his body language shifting subtly, no longer passive, but attentive in a way that suggested confirmation rather than discovery. Caleb looked up from the object and met the dog's gaze again, and this time the connection felt sharper, as if the pieces they were both witnessing were finally aligning into a single narrative neither of them had spoken aloud yet. "You kept coming back here," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady but softened by understanding, and the dog gave a faint exhale, almost imperceptible, but enough to feel like acknowledgement. The river continued its motion, but the space between them no longer felt like waiting. It felt like transition, as if the silence they had been standing inside was finally beginning to give way to something that had been held back for far too long. Caleb closed his fingers gently around the recovered pieces, feeling their weight not as evidence, but as presence, and for the first time since the night began, he understood that what lay ahead was not about finding what was lost, but about understanding why it had never truly been left behind. Caleb Morgan stood at the edge of the riverbank for a long moment without speaking, holding the worn fragments in his hand as if they carried a story that had been waiting far too long to be heard. The night air felt heavier now, not because the temperature had changed, but because understanding was beginning to settle between him and the German Shepherd like something irreversible. The dog remained close, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply existing in that narrow space where presence became communication. Caleb slowly looked down at the objects again, feeling the texture of the fabric between his fingers, noticing how time had softened its edges but not erased its meaning. Somewhere deep in his mind, fragments of recognition continued to assemble, not yet complete, but no longer random either. He exhaled slowly and shifted his weight, turning slightly toward the dog, whose eyes never left him. "You were not lost," Caleb said quietly, more like a realization than a question, and the German Shepherd lowered his head a fraction, as if acknowledging something that had been true long before Caleb arrived. The river behind them continued its steady flow, but the sound now felt distant, almost detached from the moment unfolding on the shore. Caleb took a slow step back from the water, scanning the bank again with renewed attention, noticing now the subtle patterns he had missed before, the faint compression of grass that suggested repeated visits, the way certain stones appeared more worn than others, as if chosen deliberately over time. The dog followed his movement, matching his pace without urgency, as though the next part of this understanding did not require haste. Caleb stopped near a slight bend in the shoreline where the river widened just enough to reflect the sky more clearly, and there he noticed something else partially embedded near the roots of a low shrub. He knelt again, careful not to disturb the ground too abruptly, and began clearing away damp leaves that clung together under the moisture of the night. As his fingers worked through the earth, he felt the resistance of something firm beneath the surface, and when he uncovered it, he paused longer than before. It was a small field container, the kind issued for personal gear in military operations, weathered but intact, sealed as if it had been meant to remain undisturbed until this exact moment. The German Shepherd stepped closer now, his presence no longer just observant but expectant, as though this object represented the final piece of something he had been guiding Caleb toward all along. Caleb carefully lifted the container free, feeling its weight, and for a moment simply held it without opening it, as if acknowledging that some discoveries carried emotional consequences beyond their physical form. The river wind shifted slightly, moving through the reeds with a soft rustle that filled the silence between them, and Caleb finally opened the latch. Inside, he found personal items arranged with quiet intention, each one carrying signs of time, memory, and absence, not as loss alone, but as preservation. He did not speak immediately, allowing the meaning to form naturally as he examined each piece, recognizing patterns that connected them to someone he had known, someone whose presence in his past had been steady but now felt distant in a way that could no longer be ignored. The German Shepherd sat down again beside him, watching closely, his posture steady but no longer tense, as if the act of opening the container had confirmed what he already understood. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, not in grief, but in reflection, letting the weight of recognition settle without resistance. When he opened them again, he looked at the dog differently, not as a stray or an abandoned unit animal, but as a keeper of continuity, a living connection to a life that had not ended in the way silence often suggested. The river continued its quiet movement, but the night no longer felt empty, and in that small clearing beside the water, man and dog remained together not as rescuer and rescued, but as two witnesses finally standing within the same truth. Caleb Morgan stood still for a long moment with the open container resting on a flat stone beside him, its contents partially spread in a quiet arrangement that felt intentional rather than abandoned, as if someone had once taken care to preserve meaning in the absence of certainty. The German Shepherd remained seated close by, his gaze alternating between Caleb's face and the items laid out before them, no longer restless, no longer searching, but instead anchored in a calm stillness that suggested understanding had replaced uncertainty. Caleb did not speak immediately, allowing the weight of what he was seeing to settle properly in his mind, because recognition was no longer a distant possibility, but something that had begun forming into clarity. Inside the container were personal effects tied to service life, each worn by time, but preserved with care, and as Caleb studied them one by one, fragments of memory began to align with details he had not fully connected before. He closed the container slowly, not to end the moment, but to hold it together, and then looked toward the river again, where the water continued its steady movement as if unaffected by everything that had changed on its shore. The German shepherd shifted slightly, rising from his seated position and taking a few steps forward toward the waterline, then stopping again as though checking that Caleb was still following. Caleb exhaled softly and rose to his feet, keeping a respectful distance behind the dog, sensing that whatever remained to be understood could not be rushed. The night air carried a deeper stillness now, the kind that arrives when silence stops being empty and starts becoming meaningful, and Caleb realized that the dog's presence here was not accidental, not random, and not the result of simple wandering. It was repetition shaped by memory, repetition tied to a person who had once stood in this same place and mattered enough for the dog to return again and again without instruction. Caleb followed the German shepherd along the edge of the river once more, their steps slow and synchronized in a quiet rhythm that felt less like pursuit and more like acknowledgement. The terrain shifted slightly as they moved, the river narrowing in places where roots from nearby trees reached down toward the water, and widening again where stones flattened into natural platforms along the bank. In one of these wider sections, the dog stopped again, this time more firmly, and stood facing the river for several seconds before turning his head toward Caleb, as if confirming that they had arrived at a point of significance. Caleb approached carefully, scanning the ground, and noticed faint markings in the soil that suggested repeated presence over time, not recent disturbance, but long-term pattern, as though someone had stood here often enough to leave traces that even weather could not fully erase. He knelt again, placing one hand on the damp earth, feeling the coolness beneath his palm, and began to trace the edges of the area slowly, following instinct rather than instruction. The German shepherd moved closer, standing just behind him now, close enough that Caleb could feel his presence without needing to look back. Caleb's fingers paused near a shallow indentation in the ground, and as he examined it more closely, he realized it was not random erosion, but something shaped by repeated placement of weight in the same position, like a person or animal returning to the same exact point over and over. He lifted his gaze toward the river again, and for a brief moment, he understood that this place was not simply a location, but a memory anchored in geography, one that had held significance beyond what the surface revealed. The dog let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, and lowered himself into a seated position beside Caleb, mirroring the posture from earlier in the night, but now with a sense of resolution rather than waiting. Caleb sat back slightly on his heels, feeling the cold seep through the fabric of his pants, and allowed himself to fully absorb the weight of what the night had revealed so far. The river continued its motion without pause, but everything else felt temporarily suspended, as if the world had narrowed to this single point where memory, loyalty, and time had intersected in a way that could no longer be separated. Caleb finally spoke again, not to command, not to question, but to acknowledge what was forming between them, and as he did, the German shepherd turned his head slightly toward him, holding steady eye contact that carried no confusion anymore, only recognition. In that quiet exchange, the distance between past and present began to dissolve, and what remained was not uncertainty, but the beginning of understanding that neither of them had come here alone. Caleb Morgan remained seated beside the river for a moment longer, his hands resting loosely near the damp ground, as if grounding himself to the reality unfolding around him, while the German shepherd sat just a few feet away, perfectly still, watching the water as though expecting it to speak back. The night had grown quieter in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the wind had slowed down to listen, and Caleb found himself no longer focusing on discovery, but on understanding the pattern that had led them here. The dog's presence had shifted again, no longer restless or searching, but steady, almost resolved, as if something internal had finally aligned with the physical space they were standing in. Caleb looked toward the river, then back at the dog, and realized that the repetition of this place was not coincidence, but ritual, shaped by time and memory layered over something unresolved. He stood slowly, brushing soil from his hands, and took a few careful steps closer to the waterline, scanning the surface where the reflections broke and reformed in constant motion. The German Shepherd rose with him, mirroring the movement, and for the first time since the night began, he walked not toward a discovery, but alongside Caleb as if inviting him deeper into the memory embedded in the land itself. They moved together along the riverbank once more, following the curve of the shoreline where the ground softened and the reeds thickened, creating narrow paths that felt less like terrain and more like passages shaped by repeated passage. Caleb noticed now how the dog occasionally slowed at specific points, pausing just long enough to acknowledge something unseen before continuing forward, and each pause felt deliberate rather than uncertain. The river's sound remained constant, but the world around it seemed to narrow further, concentrating attention on each step, each breath, each subtle shift in posture from the dog guiding the way. After several minutes, the German Shepherd stopped near a cluster of low stones arranged naturally, but spaced in a way that suggested familiarity, and he turned his head toward Caleb with a quiet insistence that this was not another point of observation, but the final one. Caleb approached slowly, his boots pressing softly into damp soil, and he immediately noticed how the air felt different here, not colder or warmer, but heavier, as though memory itself had condensed in this small section of riverbank. He knelt again, placing one hand on a stone while scanning the ground around it, and this time he did not need long to notice the faint impressions in the earth that formed a pattern too consistent to be accidental. The German Shepherd stepped closer until he was standing almost directly beside Caleb, and then, without hesitation, he lowered his head toward a specific point between the stones, as if indicating exactly where attention should be placed. Caleb followed the direction of the gesture and began carefully clearing away the thin layer of leaves and soil that had gathered there, revealing a shallow depression shaped by time and repetition, deeper than the surrounding ground, and clearly revisited many times before. As he studied it, something shifted in his understanding, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow recognition that what he was seeing was not simply a place where something had happened, but a place where something had been remembered. The German Shepherd remained completely still now, his gaze fixed on the same point Caleb was examining, and in that shared focus there was no confusion left, only the quiet certainty that the truth they were approaching had been present long before either of them arrived. Caleb exhaled slowly and looked out across the river again, noticing how the water curved gently around this section of bank, as if even the current had learned to move differently here, and he realized that the dog had not been returning out of aimless grief or confusion, but out of loyalty shaped by continuity, a repeated act of returning to a promise that had never been fully released. He placed his hand gently on the stone beside him, feeling its cold surface, and for the first time since the beginning of the night, he no longer felt like an outsider observing a mystery, but like someone standing inside a story that had been waiting for acknowledgement. The German Shepherd finally sat again, not facing the river this time, but facing Caleb directly, and in that simple shift there was a sense of completion forming quietly between them, as if whatever had been carried alone for too long was no longer meant to remain unspoken. The German Shepherd remained seated facing Caleb Morgan, no longer shifting his attention between the river and the land, as if something within him had finally settled into place after a long period of waiting that could not be measured in hours alone. Caleb stood slowly, feeling the weight of the night press differently now, not as uncertainty, but as recognition building layer by layer beneath his thoughts. The river continued its steady flow behind them, but its presence felt distant, almost secondary, as if the true current of the moment existed not in the water, but in the silence between man and dog. Caleb looked down at the shallow depression in the earth one final time, then at the worn fragments in his hand, and finally at the dog who had guided him here without words or hesitation. There was a clarity forming now that no longer needed further evidence. only acceptance. And when Caleb finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of understanding rather than speculation. "Daniel Hayes," he said softly, and at the sound of the name the German shepherd did not move, did not react with surprise or distress, but instead lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging something he had been carrying alone for a very long time. The name hung in the air for a moment, blending with the sound of the river, and Caleb felt a shift inside him that came not from discovery alone, but from the realization that memory can persist in places long after absence becomes permanent. The dog exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to release tension rather than create it, and then he stood once more, stepping closer to Caleb until the space between them felt intentionally closed. Caleb did not step back. Instead, he knelt again, this time not to search or investigate, but to meet the dog at eye level, recognizing that whatever remained between them was no longer about finding objects or confirming details, but about acknowledging presence. The German shepherd held his gaze steadily, and in that silence Caleb understood that this animal had not simply been returning to a location, but returning to a person who was no longer physically present, yet still deeply anchored in this place. Caleb looked toward the river again, and for a brief moment he imagined the continuity of all the nights this dog had spent here alone, not lost, not wandering, but repeating a ritual of remembrance that only now had a witness. The weight of that realization settled deeply, not as sorrow alone, but as something more complex, something closer to respect for a loyalty that had endured beyond explanation. Caleb slowly placed the recovered items back into the container and closed it carefully, as if preserving not just objects but the integrity of what they represented. The German shepherd remained still beside him, his posture no longer uncertain, and Caleb placed one hand gently on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady presence beneath the fur, warm and real against the cold air of the riverbank. The gesture was simple, but it carried meaning that did not require language, and the dog accepted it without hesitation, lowering his head slightly in response. The river continued its flow, but the moment no longer felt defined by movement or discovery, but by acknowledgement, as if something unresolved had finally been witnessed in full. Caleb remained kneeling for a few seconds longer, letting the silence settle completely around them, then slowly rose to his feet, keeping his hand resting lightly on the dog for a brief moment before letting go. The German shepherd did not move away. Instead, he stayed close, now no longer guiding or searching, but simply remaining, as if the act of remembering had reached its natural completion in the presence of someone who finally understood. Caleb looked once more across the river, then back to the dog, and in that final exchange there was no longer uncertainty or distance, only the quiet recognition that some bonds do not end with absence, but continue through the places where memory refuses to fade. Caleb Morgan stood beside the German shepherd at the riverbank, both of them now completely still, as if the night itself had decided there was nothing left to reveal and only silence remained to confirm it. The air felt lighter in a strange way, not because anything had changed in the environment, but because something within the moment had reached its natural conclusion. Caleb looked at the dog one final time, studying the calmness in his posture, the absence of confusion, the presence of acceptance that had replaced everything that once felt like searching. The river continued its steady flow behind them, reflecting faint traces of moonlight that broke apart and reformed endlessly, indifferent to the weight of human understanding standing at its edge. Caleb slowly exhaled, feeling the finality of recognition settle fully into place, not as a discovery waiting to be solved, but as a truth that no longer required interpretation. Daniel Hayes, he repeated softly in his mind, no longer as a question or realization, but as acknowledgement of something that had already been known by the one standing beside him long before he arrived. The German shepherd did not move, but his presence shifted in a subtle way, no longer directed outward toward the river or the land, but inward, grounded, as if the act of being witnessed had completed something essential within him. Caleb reached down slowly and placed a hand on the dog's shoulder once more, this time without hesitation, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur that contrasted with the cold air surrounding them. There was no urgency in the gesture, no attempt to change or fix anything, only presence shared between two living beings who now understood the same absence. The river wind passed gently through the reeds, creating a soft sound that filled the silence without breaking it, and Caleb realized that this place would always hold more than physical memory. It held continuity, repetition, and loyalty that had outlasted explanation. He looked out across the water again, and for a brief moment imagined the countless nights this dog had stood in the same position, returning without instruction, not because of confusion, but because loyalty sometimes becomes a form of remembrance that cannot be abandoned. Caleb felt no need to speak further, because everything that needed to be understood had already been communicated through stillness, through presence, through the shared weight of what could not be undone. The German Shepherd finally turned his head slightly toward Caleb, not in search of direction, but in quiet acknowledgement that the moment had come to its end without loss, only understanding. Caleb nodded once, a small and deliberate motion that carried more meaning than words could hold, then slowly stepped back from the river's edge, giving the dog space without breaking the connection that had formed between them. The night remained unchanged around them, yet it no longer felt uncertain or heavy, only complete in a way that required no further continuation. Caleb turned once more toward the river before beginning to walk back along the shoreline, his steps steady, unhurried, while the German Shepherd remained at the water's edge for a few seconds longer, watching the place he had come to so many times before. Then, with calm certainty, the dog stood and followed, no longer searching, no longer waiting, but simply moving forward beside the one who now carried the understanding of where he had been all along. The river continued behind them, flowing as it always had, but the story it held no longer belonged to silence alone. It now belonged to memory that had finally been seen and acknowledged under the quiet light of a passing night.